Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Tamiya IS-2, or as the box says, JS-2, which I suppose is probably a little bit more correct in English, being that this is a Joseph Stalin tank. Russian doesn't have a proper J sound, so IS-2 is also correct. This is, as the box tells us, a 48th scale model, and Tamiya's 48th scale range have so far been some of my favourite models to build. There's nothing on the back of the box, but inside we get a bunch of sprues moulded in a dark green colour, which I suspect is intended to look close to Russian green, whatever Russian green is. There are 7 sprues in the box, though a couple of them, like those with the tracks and wheels, are duplicated. They're all quite nice and neat like I would expect from Tamiya. There are mould lines because, well, it's a plastic injection moulding, isn't it? There are always mould lines to some degree. These mould lines are very minor, and while you will need to do a bit of cleanup, it won't be much, and you'll probably spend more time cleaning up the sprue gates where you've cut the parts off the sprues. In my experience, there's very rarely a need to spend much time cleaning and preparing these kits, which is certainly one of my favourite things about them. The parts have a good amount of detail, and the cast armour texture on the cast parts is quite nice. I couldn't tell you how realistic the detailing is, but I think it's quite good. These kits are not high-end, extreme detail rivet counter pleasing kits, but they do have plenty of detail that should be satisfactory for most, and I'm sure there's nothing to stop you from modifying it and customizing it to improve accuracy. But to be honest, I think you'd probably have more luck in finding parts for that in 35th scale. Anyway, that's not a problem for Herbert. I do have one minor complaint about the plastic, and that is the holes for mounting the hand railings around the turret were mostly non-existent, and you'll see me complain about that again later. There are things in this box that are a little bit less plasticky, like this, well, I don't know what kind of string this is, but it's a stringy object intended to be used as a towing cable. We also get some polycaps, and that means we're going to see some sick, filthy polycap action a bit later on. There are also some metal weights. Most of these kits come with an added weight of some sort. Sometimes the lower hull is die-cast metal, or there are metal plates, or in this case cylinders, that get mounted inside the hull. The decals, shown here, include markings for 4 paint variants, including Czechoslovak and Polish tanks. If none of these do it for you, I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to find other suitable decals. They look pretty good to me, and in my experience, Tamiya's decals have always worked pretty well. There's a sheet of information about the IS-2, which even points out a few of the components of the tank. There's also an instruction sheet, which if you somehow don't understand the concept of an instruction sheet, has some nice, relatively easy to read and follow diagrams that show us how the model goes together. I do have one minor complaint about these too, but I'll talk about that when I get to it. Anyway, the time has come for the gluing together of bits of plastic, and I guess, at least at the start, bits of metal to plastic. Actually, they don't really need to be glued into place, I just like to do it to prevent movement, which isn't really a huge issue, but I do it anyway. I use super glue because the weights are metal, and I glue the plastic end cap holdy things onto one end of each weight. You can see there are guides for the weight holders on the hull bottom, so I glue those on. I then glue the other end onto the weight and hull bottom using appropriate glues for each part. And now we've got a nice weighty hull. These weights are of course optional. Some people like their tanks to have a bit of heft, and some don't, so it's perfectly fine to leave these out if you prefer. Next, I work on the lower rear plate. If you wanted, you could leave these details off until you've got the hull together, but there isn't anything too delicate here, so you probably won't break anything if you do it in the order the instructions instruct, as I've done. This step involves gluing the 2 hooky lifty thingies on, and 2 spare track links. I follow this with pretty much the same thing on the lower front plate. The lifty things are much the same. The tracks are, well, they're the same too. I mean, the tank only carries one kind of track link after all. These are just oriented vertically instead of horizontally, and there's more of them. There's some keying to guide these, so it's all rather easy. Lower hull assembly is the next step, starting with the sides. You should find it pretty hard to do this wrong because of the way the parts are shaped, though you may still find you need to apply some pressure to minimize the gaps because the long flat parts do have a bit of a bend to them that can cause them to not sit flat without assistance. I wouldn't say that's a big problem though. I then add the lower front plate assembly, which did need a bit of pressure, but it goes on nice and easy. Then the rear plate, which didn't really need any pressure. And with that, we've got a nice lower hull, ready to do lower hull things, I guess. The torsion bar swing arms come next, and you will need to pay a tiny bit of attention here. Don't worry, not too much. There are 6 openings for the swing arms on either side, and the first 5 look like this. The 6th one is a bit different, and occupies the forwardmost position. I assume this is just a stronger swing arm, because it's at the front. You can see it's a bit thicker, and has a more square shape to it. Above that, we place an arm for the idler wheel. All of these parts are keyed, so it's pretty difficult, though not impossible, to get this wrong. Now, we're ready for wheels. These do require some assembly before we can put them on the tank though. Each wheel is made up of 2 parts. The road wheels and idler, which in this case is the same as the road wheels, have keying, which ensures they're lined up properly, so you'll be able to look all the way through the holes in the wheels. Won't that be fun? We end up with this bunch of wheels, and we might as well complete the set by putting the drive sprocket together. Here's some of that polycap insertion action that I know you all like. The 2 halves of the drive sprocket go together nice and easily with the polycap in the centre, and the keying helps get the teeth lined up properly. Then I add I guess you might call it a hubcap. I don't have a better word for it. This is yet another easily positioned part. Now that we've got all of the wheels together, the time of wheel attachment is upon us. Because the idler and road wheels are all the same, there's not really much to think about here. All you've got to do is stick them on the correct axles. There is a little bit of play to them, so you may need to do some eyeballing and appropriate nudging, but it's not really much of a challenge. The return rollers go onto the smaller axles along the top of the hull, and like the other wheels, this is easy, though a little bit of eyeballing and nudging may be needed. This mud removal device, whatever you might call it, comes next, and this is easy to place. I was initially concerned that this might impede the drive sprocket later on, but as you can see, it doesn't. The drive sprocket goes on with no issue at all, and we don't need to glue this because the polycaps hold them in place with the power of friction, which means it can be adjusted to fit the tracks. And why not put the tracks on now? The slack modelled into the upper run of tracks is the closest thing we have to keying here, so that's the obvious place to start. I guess that's why the instructions say to do that. These are, obviously, link and length tracks, and they're a lot like all of the other track sets in other Tamiya 48th scale kits. They're not hard to put on, though they can be a bit fiddly. The instructions usually give you an order in which to attach the tracks, and that is the case here too. You don't have to follow it, but it does usually work out better if you do. I do like this kind of track set, and I think they're far superior to rubber band tracks, especially on a tank like this where the tracks have a lot of slack in them. Now that all the tracks are on, it's time to work on the upper hull, and I'm immediately making a mistake. The mistake is not actually drilling out these holes. You do need to drill some of them, but not all of them. You only need to drill out the holes on one side. These are so you can mount a horn and a headlamp. In fairness, the instructions weren't especially obvious that there was a choice between the left and right side mounting for these parts, which is why there's 4 holes instead of 2. This is obviously a mistake on my part, but it would be nice if the instructions were a little bit more clear. Moving on, I add this part in behind the driver's vision slot. Now, you can't look inside the hull and see that there's no interior detail. Take that. I follow this by gluing together the external fuel tanks, and this is pretty simple. The main barrel parts are keyed, and so are the ends. You may need to do a bit of nudging to deal with gaps on the barrel sides, but nothing too tricky, and we end up with 4 nice barrel-y boys. Might as well stick those onto the hull right away, before we get a chance to lose them. There are slots to guide the positioning, but there is quite a bit of vertical play to them. Unless they're wildly out of place, the main thing here is that you get them lined up with each other. They'll look a bit off if they don't line up with each other. I then assemble the towing cables. I think the cable material here might be a little bit too thick for the end parts, and it kind of sticks too far out the bottom. The plastic part should go all the way around the cable, but it doesn't. It could be worse, I guess, and you don't actually have to use this if you don't want. Next, I glue the upper hull onto the lower hull. This is a bit earlier than the instructions say to do it, but I didn't see that it would cause any issues, and you know what? It didn't. I was surprised too. I did have a little bit of trouble getting the parts lined up and a bit of force was needed. I don't know if that's just the way the kit is, or if I did something wrong when putting the lower hull together. Whatever the issue, in the end I got things together, and we've got a nice solid hull. The reason I chose to put this together now instead of later was to avoid potentially damaging parts with my mighty pressure application. Call me crazy, but I feel like it's better to apply that pressure before too many breakable parts are added. So, now we can add those parts. First, I add the front mudguards. These have a sort of tab that slots under the front part of the hull, so they pretty much drop right into place with minimum effort. Soviet tank crews loved chopping down trees, so a saw is included and mounts onto a couple of little recesses on the left side of the hull like so. This kit doesn't include the traditional Soviet log, but with a saw, the crew can obtain their own relatively easily. Just forward of that, we install the vodka box. I guess if you were desperate you could put tools in there, but it's definitely intended for vodka.
Ha ha ha! Stereotypes are funny!
Yes. There's a couple of guides that make it easy to put this on. Then, I install the horn and headlamp. As I mentioned before, I mistakenly drilled holes for these on both sides, but I'm installing the parts on the left side, so whenever I get around to painting this, it'll either be the regular Soviet version, or maybe the Czechoslovakian version, which I am leaning heavily towards. I just think that might be a bit more interesting. Obviously there are now 2 holes that I don't want, but it'll be a very minor job to fill those with putty. Anyway, the horn and headlamp are on, now we can honk and see in the dark. At the front right of the tank I add these shackles. I assume these are for towing, or maybe they're just for fun. Either way, they're here, and the glue should stop them from going anywhere. Near the middle of the hull I add this box. A shovel goes on forward of that box, and the guides make this very easy to place. I can dig it. At the rear of the hull, I add the travel lock for the main gun. You don't want your gun to be all wibbly wobbly while the tank's on a train or something like that, so you've got to lock it down. The instructions then say to add the towing cables we put together earlier, and there's a couple of little hook things for them. It was kind of fiddly and annoying to try and figure out how to mount these properly, so I just didn't. I wasn't really liking the way the towing cables themselves were looking in the first place. Anyway, the hull is done, so get ready for turret time. I start by assembling the main gun, which is pretty simple. Obviously, being a 2-piece gun, you might have to do some work to deal with gaps or seams along the barrel, but it goes together pretty neatly without too much effort. I then glue the gun into the mantlet. This is keyed, so you don't get the muzzle brake all wonky. Very few people want a wonky muzzle brake. I set that aside because now it's time for some more sick polycap action. They get pressed onto the pins here on the sides of the gun holdy bit. Simple enough. Then the side parts, which will hold this inside the front of the turret, can be pressed on. Probably make sure you're doing this around the right way. I didn't realise I wasn't doing that, so I glued that assembly into the turret front part. You can see there's some guides for this, which is of course helpful. This might look fine and dandy, but there's an error here that old Herbert was unaware of. Being unaware of it, I moved on and glued the 2 halves of the turret together. You might like to do a little bit of putty work along where the parts join, but it's not too bad. I then glue the turret front assembly into place, and this goes on without issue. The commander's cupola goes on next, and this goes into place as easily as it looks. I'm sure you could put it on wrong, but that would take more effort than just doing it right would. The loader's hatch drops into place next to that, and I suppose, if you wanted, you could model this open. I prefer closed. Before we can add the commander's hatch, we need to add this ring. This will hold the 2 halves of the hatch together and prevent them from falling into the turret, if that wasn't obvious. I did have a little bit of trouble getting both halves of the hatch to sit in place, so I glued them together and then installed them. That's obviously not going to work if you want to model the hatch open, and you'll probably need the hatch open if you want to include the commander figure. I don't, and like I said, I prefer it closed, so that's easy for me. The machine gun on the rear of the turret goes on next, and this is made up of 2 parts. The mounting part, whatever you want to call it, goes on first, and then the gun. Easy. There are some lift points around the turret that we have to add, and these are small fiddly parts, though they're not too hard to place. There's no keying, but there are some flat pads for them all to mount onto, and it's not too hard to use that to eyeball the positioning. I would say they don't really need to be perfectly straight anyway. It is a Soviet vehicle after all. I follow this with the hand railings. these were a little bit more challenging to place, mostly because other than the first one I installed, none of the mounting points were visible. The instructions would suggest that there are visible mounting spots for all of these, but that's not the case. Instead, I had to eyeball the positioning for all of them, so some of them are going to be a bit wonky, but not terribly so, and like I just said, it is a Soviet tank. And while this was a little bit annoying, I wouldn't consider it a huge problem. I mean, I did get the parts onto the tank, so it could be worse. Then, I tried to install the main gun, and here's where that gun holdy bit being installed incorrectly became a problem. The mantlet shouldn't be sitting that far off the front of the turret, and the keying was one of the things preventing it from being installed properly, and that's because the inner part is upside down. My solution was to cut the internal holdy part out, because that's only really needed if you want to have a gun that can elevate and depress. It's not really a feature I care about, so this works for me. I did try removing the keying, but it turns out the internal part isn't symmetrical, so it would still hold the gun a bit too high anyway. Oh well, the gun can still be glued into place directly on the front of the turret. All we really lose is the ability to change the elevation of the gun once it's been glued on. Above the mantlet we have this little cover thing, which I assume is to stop stuff from getting in between the mantlet and the turret and jamming things up. That's easy enough to get into place, and that's the turret completed. The turret is held onto the hull with a simple locking tab mechanism, and that's it. The Tamiya 48 scale IS-2 model 1944 CHKZ or CHKZ, which I believe means it was made in the Chelyabinsk Kirov factory. Whatever it means, the model is now complete. There were more problems with this kit than I usually have with Tamiya's 48th scale models, though as far as problems go they were very minor, and obviously haven't stopped the model from being built, and it doesn't prevent the end result from being a nice representation of the IS-2, and I'm pretty happy with it. There's a couple of spots I think could do with a little bit of work before painting, but that's not especially unusual. It does go together quite nicely, and if you pay more attention to the instructions than I did, you could save yourself some time and effort by not drilling out holes you don't need to, and putting the gun mount around the right way. Now that you know of these mistakes, you can avoid them. Herbert Erpaderp makes the mistakes, so you don't have to. Anyway, the kit was quick, easy and fun to put together, and I would certainly suggest this or pretty much any of the other Tamiya 48th scale kits for a beginner. They're fairly forgiving, and the end result is rather nice. I'm not an IS-2 expert, so I can't tell you if this is 100% accurate, or if the angle of the travel lock is out by 2 degrees or whatever, but it does look quite convincing, and at least for my purposes, that's enough. Anyway, I don't have anything else to say that you can't see with your own eyes, so instead of waffling, I'm going to go and do Herbert things. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. If you want to watch me build kits like this one live on stream, head over to my Twitch channel, which is where I stream pretty much everything you see on this channel. The link is in the description. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell for reasons, and if you'd like to see my videos a bit early before there's any ads, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to Patreon, and all my other things like Discord and social media in the description below. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.